Good evening, everybody. Bonsoir tout le monde. Puisqu'il y a traduction simultanée, je ne vais pas faire mon discours en français, je vais continuer en anglais. I was watching the digital wall go up, and it could almost be a summary of what I'm going to talk about, which is essentially what I wish for and what I am concerned about, what I'm worried about in this whole issue of technology. I've done the introduction, and my hypothesis, my optimistic hypothesis, is that there can be such a thing as a human-centered use of technology. And in fairness, there should be a question mark after that, because I think this is an open question. What's really interesting to me as a starting point is how the word technology has changed in meaning. If you look at this dictionary definition, the application of scientific knowledge for practical purposes, and especially in industry, I'll leave out the red part, machinery and equipment developed from the application of scientific knowledge. Only in the last perhaps 20 years or so have we come to an understanding of technology so that whenever we use the word, we're referring to something related to computers, to the digital world, which is kind of an interesting twist. And as you'll see, I am going to talk as a kind of cautionary tale about an earlier meaning of technology and an earlier version of technology, which I spent a great deal of my career wrestling with. So I think a number of things have to be said right at the outset. This phenomenon seems to be inevitable. We're doing it because we can. There's something in our nature that will always push those limits. There's obviously a drive for profit. There's a drive for convenience. But is this an unequivocal good? And are there, and this is a rhetorical question, critical choices that we have to make about technology? And I want to talk, first of all, about what we can learn from past embraces of technologies in cities. Uncritical adoption leading to collateral damage, to unforeseen consequences, aftershocks, reassessment, and then reaction. And I'm going to use this cautionary tale to alert us to the need to anticipate this possibility and test our embrace of technology against other values that we have. So here's my cautionary tale, and it has to do with the post-war embrace of the automobile, which clearly the internal combustion engine at the time was a wonderful invention, which we, in hindsight, have overused and abused. And I would liken this moment to 1939, the New York World's Fair, the Futurama Pavilion, which was put up by General Motors, which millions and millions of people came to see, enthralled by the possibility for transforming cities based on the use of the automobile. And General Motors at that time was not so much selling cars as they were selling a way of life. And people went on this moving circular platform around a gigantic diorama. And curiously, if you look at that, it looks, what that diorama portrayed was something that looks extraordinarily like much of the suburban environment surrounding all of our cities in North America. So here was the euphoria. People thought these images are from right after World War II. The fact that young families could get these automobiles, there was a mass exodus from the city, that this would be the gateway to a new and wonderful form of life, and uncritically so. And what that led to, very quickly, is a total restructuring of the city, which was replicated all over North America and across the world. And it became what I sometimes refer to as the suburban industrial complex, playing off Dwight Eisenhower's evocation of the military industrial complex. And it involved a really efficient organization of financial institutions, developers, lawyers, builders, brokers, real estate agents, road contractors, who all became incredibly adept at producing this kind of environment. And this could be a Google image of pretty much any city in North America, producing this by the kilometer very quickly. And so where did that lead? If you go clockwise in these images, this is kind of time travel out of the city after the war. You have upper left, a pre-automobile part of the city. As you move to the right, the roads get wider, the radii at the curbs get larger, the buildings get pushed back, you have parking lots appearing in front of the buildings, and eventually you get out into an environment where you really are not meant to be as a pedestrian. It's kind of akin to being standing on the tarmac in an airfield. It has that quality. You're not welcome. So this produced, all my text has disappeared, so I will simply explain that Life magazine cover appeared in 1961, and it was already pointing out that this phenomenon was testing to failure as quickly as it was created. The roads filled up, the highways, the interstate highways in the US filled up. We polluted the atmosphere. We developed something that we hadn't anticipated, which was a public health crisis from a sedentary lifestyle, where essentially we have levels of obesity, hypertension, heart disease, even in children, that we had never anticipated, and we developed a complete dependence on fossil fuels. So this is the world that we created, and belatedly we realized that this kind of environment could actually be harmful to your health. And so this is a wordle that shows the heavy toll that this began to take on people's lives. And this is something produced by the medical officer of health in Toronto, where you can see that as you move out of the city center into the post-war parts of the city that were created around the automobile, all of those health problems that I was mentioning start to appear, related proportionally to how much people are car dependent and how much they're not walking anymore and how much they have actually bought into that kind of environment. So what has happened is a substitution now, which is really interesting. This is the reaction part of the so-called American dream, or dare I call it the North American dream, which was to have your own house, your own lot, your own garden. Every adult had a car, and that became a fleet of cars for every adult in the household, to the point where we now have a competing and increasingly more potent version of the dream, which is to live in a neighborhood where you can walk to buy your groceries, where you have access to transit, where you can use a bicycle, and where you can live in a compact environment. This has been the subject of a book that I wrote, which has been my struggle over the past 2 decades with that earlier version of technology. And Walking Home, I think, says it all. But the key part of a massive paradigm shift that we have undergone is a reassessment of the technology that drove that transformation of the urban world and the way in which it insidiously reshaped the environment that we live in. The pushback started as a grassroots movement, and my sister, who's an anthropologist, often pointed out to me that survival in culture depends on people who keep practices that are no longer popular alive so that they can be called upon at a future time when they're needed for the survival of a civilization. And in fact, in our case, the older neighborhoods, the pre-war neighborhoods, actually became a living example when people started to embrace them of all of those virtues of connectivity, of local shopping, of kids being able to get to school on a bicycle or walking, all of those qualities that we had lost with that embrace of automobile technology. The Urban Land Institute had this show up on their radar screen in 2013. This is the most prestigious organization of developers in North America and probably in the world at this time, and they sent out a brochure to their members, people who are building real estate, and said, your consumers are now looking for something else. They're not just looking for the view from a tall condo, they're actually looking for a neighborhood. And so my first assignment for the City of Toronto was in this area, which is east of downtown Toronto. It's not kind of surrounding the St. Lawrence Market. And when I started there, recruited by Mayor David Crombie back in the late 70s, long time ago, that's what it looked like. It was a gigantic parking lot. All the buildings were being torn down to provide cheap parking for the office buildings at King and Bay in the heart of Toronto. And this is what has happened since as part of the paradigm shift and reaction. All of the surface parking has disappeared. It's all been replaced by mixed income, mixed use buildings, tens of thousands of people living there, public spaces, and so on. I was talking to a young woman earlier in the crowd whose thesis now is about what happens to parking lots. This is actually a great example of reverse engineering from an excessive embrace of a certain technology. We're having to learn how to rethink how we move in cities, obviously, getting back on our feet, getting into transit. Who would have thought that the bicycle would reappear as a major form of transportation in the 21st century? Critical political decisions, stopping the spread of the highway network. William Davis, then the premier of the province, made this extraordinary decision. And so the realization had obviously become quite widespread by that point that this was extremely problematic. We have now a whole new generation of engineering of streets, which, yes, we still have automobiles, but where we've reversed the pyramid, reversed the priorities. So top priority goes to pedestrians, next cyclists, next public transit, and the automobiles have their place. So the appropriate use of the technology, not its being abolished, but actually put in the context of a different set of values. This is a street design manual from New York City, which is actually redesigning all of its rights-of-way, piece by piece, all through the 5 boroughs, and in light of that reversed set of priorities. So again, reassessing the technology. This is a great organization called 8 to 80 Cities, which is a Canadian nonprofit that argues that if you make a city work for an 8-year-old and an 80-year-old as indicator species, from the standpoint of active transportation, personal mobility, it actually works for everyone. And here's a surprising finding, that people aged 60 to 79, and I fall nicely in that category, account for more than a third of the biking boom. Who would have thought? This is not just young people who are doing this. So I served as interim chief planner in the city of Boston when the Big Dig was going on. This was the central artery built in 1950, which drove this enormous wedge through the heart of the city, which has been replaced by the Rose Kennedy Greenway, which you see here. This is all about that reverse engineering. Here's the project that James mentioned, which is this piece of elevated highway in downtown Toronto called the Gardiner Expressway, erected at about the same time. And I got involved with a wonderful couple of donors, Will and Judy Matthews, in creating something which, through a public competition, is now called the Bentway. We originally called it Project Under Gardiner, and we have repurposed that space, 10 acres, almost 2 kilometers under the Gardiner Expressway, as a public space. On January 6th, we opened a skating trail, which you see here. We had 20,000 people who came out the first weekend in 30 below weather to actually experience this, and we'll be running year-round programs in this space. So again, taking something that was designed for one purpose, that was an unloved, hidden space hiding in plain sight in the heart of the city, and turning it into something completely different in light of a totally new set of priorities. And this is what happened on social media, a virtual explosion when people found themselves able to use this space in an entirely different way. So I would argue that this is part of a whole movement that has occurred of seeing the city completely differently, of instead of the pattern that we had fallen into of having a mental map of the city which was described by numbered highways or by major vehicular arterials. We're starting to understand the city, and this, of course, is Toronto, navigating it by greenways, by ravines, by public spaces, by a whole network of active transportation, which is kind of reflecting this flip in values that we're experiencing. So now let me apply that cautionary tale to where we are now. We are just at the beginning, I think early days, or perhaps significantly already into another paradigm shift, which is coming about through the embrace of this new version of technology. It is touching every aspect of our lives. As was pointed out, it is absolutely pervasive. And can we draw some parallels with our experience with the automobile in terms of making choices about how to use this technology? Clearly, it opens many remarkable possibilities for cities, but also raises many very valid concerns, including concerns around privacy, control, ownership, use of data, potential for social isolation, narrow banding, loss of common ground with implications for the heterogeneous society that we are, particularly in Canada, diminished human non-virtual encounters, which is a great preoccupation for me, loss of social skills. People who are uncomfortable actually talking to each other would prefer to text and talk, which I find absolutely incomprehensible. But the question is, can we selectively and consciously harness the best that the technology can offer in a mindful way without sacrificing the qualities of cities that we value? Now, eliminating human contact is nothing new. This is the automat from New York City in the 1940s. This was a big deal. Instead of going into a restaurant and dealing with a waiter, you walked up to this wall, and all these meals appeared from behind the wall. There were actually cooks behind there. This wasn't being done by robots. This was all being done by hand, but this was a great novelty that you could avoid human beings this way. And this is the contemporary version of the automat called Itza, where, again, you're pulling your food out of a wall and you're not interacting with another human being. And then this phenomena, which is becoming very quickly arriving upon us, of getting to shopping, being entirely alone, essentially replacing all human contact. So the real question for me, and I use retail or shopping as an example, is shopping only about consuming and getting the goods and services that we need in the most efficient, cheapest way? Or is there something about the experience of being on a shopping street, being in a market, as a social experience? The sights, the sounds, the smells, the contact, the chance encounters, the ability to act and interact with other human beings that actually brings an entirely different set of values. Do we really want Amazon to wipe out all of our main streets, which is their avowed purpose? I think that's a reasonable question to ask. So this is just a cartoon from the New Yorker that I quite liked. But here we are now, no more cashiers. Is this fun? This is the new Amazon store. You can walk in and out without exchanging a word with anybody, never encountering a human being who would know anything about any of the products that are there, the produce, the fish, the meat, the cheeses, all the things that we like to talk about when we actually go to a market. Clearly there's a place for this, but do we want, is that the world that we want to live in? To what extent are we willing or deciding without being conscious about it to retreat into virtual cyber worlds, eliminating human contact? This is something that drives me crazy in the airports. There is an American company that is actually installing these screens, excuse me, everywhere in the waiting areas in airports. So rather than sitting and talking to people, wherever you sit down, you're immediately face-to-face with a screen, which is bombarding you with information, obviously trying to sell you things. I like this quote from Michelle Obama recently when she came to visit Toronto. Social media can do two things. It can bring us together or it can keep us isolated. A life looking into your phone is not a life, she said. You have to break out of your silo. There was a really interesting piece in the Globe and Mail last week. This was a conversation between Jim Basile and a psychiatrist named David Deutsch. I would really urge you to read it, particularly the comments of David Deutsch, the psychiatrist. But he was really arguing that phone addiction and FOMO, fear of missing out, can actually stunt growth, particularly in this next generation of children, that it does things to our brains that make it increasingly difficult for us to actually have and enjoy social interaction. The fear of talking to other human beings, of making eye contact, all of those social skills that are put at risk. And it's a very chilling conversation. So the question is, do we want, this is a Starbucks. Starbucks, of course, are designed for no human interaction. Everybody is sitting there with their laptop or their phone. Do we want to be alone together, or do we want to actually be together? This is a little cafe in my neighborhood that I really like. You'll see the screens there. It's not that technology isn't present, but I want you to look at where people are sitting. There's a counter where you sit and have your coffee and your pastry or your sandwich. It's 30 centimeters wide. It's a long plank. So when you sit there, as those people are doing, you are actually invited to have a conversation with your neighbors, and it works. And you don't feel like you're pressured to do so, but it is an environment that is designed for people to interact. Now, what are the implications for a heterogeneous society? I've mentioned that. I love this pair of photographs. On the top at the old Gooderman-Wirtz distillery in Toronto, you had the guys, and they were guys in the early part of the 20th century who worked there, who all lined themselves up against a wall. And more recently, the people who work in the distillery district decided to replicate that photo. And of course, you see the gender differences. You see people from all over the world, all ages. Society has changed completely. What if we never get to actually know each other face to face? What are the implications of that? What if we're only encountering each other online or through the windshields of automobiles as our society becomes more and more heterogeneous? These are the kinds of things that can happen. This was in Brampton, where a group of people from Western Canada came in and started putting this poster up, trying to develop fear and phobia about the South Asian population. And they took a photograph, which was not Canada at all. It was a riot that happened in India. And what I loved was the high school students in Brampton replicated the poster and portrayed themselves and said, yes, this is really the world that we want, because they were being told by this other poster to fear it. I think in order for that to happen, we need the human interaction. So this is where I am kind of coming to. This is from I don't expect you to read this. This is from a recent article I wrote in Spacing. I would encourage you to have a look at it. But what I basically argue, and this is the reason I have involved myself with Sidewalk, is that we have to not ignore this wave of technology. We have to proactively engage with it. We have to raise these issues. We have to bring value-laden questions into the conversation, talk about appropriate use of the technology, where we want sophisticated technology, where we want low-tech or no-tech in our cities, and make conscious choices. So the question, I'll just read the last sentence. The questions for me often come down to how a human-centered urbanism could be aided by technology, not be subverted by it. Can we assess potential solutions against human values and decide when to say no, not exactly, bend, inflect, and choose? So here is a younger colleague of mine expressing what she sees as the bargain. Her name is Zara Ibrahim. She's very involved as a community activist in many things in Toronto. So this is what she said to me. The change in our expectations that's being shaped through our digital lives, i.e., I'm giving you my data, give me a better experience, is about to hit our urban lives as the urban data movement hits us. Citizens will expect a relatively biometric city, organic, responsive, nuanced in understanding what they need. That's, can we turn the inevitability into a virtue, in other words? And I'm going to end by just saying, as I have been working with the Sidewalk Project in Toronto, I'm just going to give you a few examples of areas where I think the technology used properly can actually bring great value and judiciously. So one is this notion of radical mixed use. As we move away from segregating where we live, from where we work, we shop, recreation, culture in our cities, separating income by geography and so on, there are ways in which we can use technology in terms of developing flexible, fungible building types that actually are far more adaptable in accommodating those kinds of seamless mixes and interactions. Mobility options. The famous last mile. A lot of our cities are very sparsely populated, too sparsely for conventional public transit. Can we use, for example, the inevitability of automated vehicles, not privately owned, but as part of transportation services, to pick up areas which conventional transportation is not able to address? Dealing with waste and waste management. Clearly, there are all kinds of ways in which the sorting of waste, the transmission of waste through our cities can be improved by new technologies. Weather mitigation features, making the shoulder seasons in our cities more adaptable. Now, this is going to be a combination of low-tech, no-tech, and high-tech in order to accomplish that. There's a whole area of wood composite modular buildings, which is being explored by Sidewalk. Innovations in regulation and financing. And this has a lot to do with affordable housing. So these are just a few of the many, many areas where I think with a hard look and with an eyes wide open view of the technology, we can benefit. But I go back to my essential point. What we have to be careful of is an uncritical kind of euphoric embrace of the technology, letting it tell us what kinds of lives we would like to live. Thank you very much.